Thank you so much, Diana. I first met Diana 3 or 4 years ago when we were working on a conference program for Cape Town of the African Association for the Study of Religion. And sometimes the distinctions between a junior colleague and a senior colleague are blurred when you meet someone who is so committed, someone who brings to the table so many ideas, and those ideas made our conference in Cape Town very, very successful. I mean, I'm actually glad to say that was the first one that we actually made money. And I think that was due to the kind of advice you gave me, but also her interest and deep interest in the religions and traditions of Africa has impressed me every conversation. About Professor Bass and Ochono, what can you say? Intellectually, if you come to Vanderbilt, it is as if you have deliberately gone into the den with some of the smartest people on earth, the people who animate African dialogue in many, many ways. Professor Bass doesn't know this, but I appreciate his work in music in Africa so much because growing up, they taught us in school to sing, and I still remember that little book Out of East Africa by Graham Hislop, Since Singing is So Good, I think. It's the kind of thing that taught me how to read music working on my own, and I've always followed your work on the rich musical traditions of Africa. And then, you know, my brother Moses, I don't know what you can say. I think if there is one person that challenges us to think critically about who we are, but also to act responsibly, I think Professor Ochono does that. So it's with great intimidation that I'm here this afternoon to introduce this research project with you. The title is Land and Authority in Post-Colonial Cameroon. For those of you who have not seen the paper, let me read a story out of a Nigerian newspaper. The Nigerian musician and late evangelist Sonny Okosun, whom I will call a political philosopher, released his song Papa's Land in 1979. Many who love his music and still remember it today remember these words. Africa is my father's land, yes, Africa is my papa's land. Will you let my people go? We want to rule from Cape to Cairo. Will you free my people's hands? We want to rule papa's land. In those days, Nigeria had just enough self-respect and not only an idea of its own place in the global scheme of things, but also the massive responsibility it had in the liberation of Southern Africa. Nigeria took the lead in investing financially, and so philosophically and in terms of activism, what Sonny Okosun expressed reflected this. It was land in Southern Africa, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia, but I think if we go back to that song today, we could ask the same question of almost every African country who owns Papa's land. So land and authority in post-colonial Africa is an organizing idea that I am working with together with a friend from Cameroon, another research assistant, through the Contending Modernity projects out of the University of Notre Dame. The simple argument here today is that land presents one idea where modernity is contested, but not only contested, but it is an idea that brings in the conflicts of authority that we see. And here, authority in the case of post-colonial Cameroon or Africa will deal with state authority, that is the government of Cameroon, as represented by the local administration, the divisional administrator, the senior divisional officer, who is something comparable to a county judge here in the United States. Then the other authorities, of course, will be what is called different names: local authority, traditional authority, the chiefs, the Obas, and all of the people who rule in a position that is hereditary, a position that is dictated and controlled by the powers of the ancestors. And then the third layer of authority here is religious authority and the authority of religious communities. And so the argument broadly is that land as a commodity poses significant challenges to modernity, and that is played out in the interactions that take place between individuals and all of these layers of authority. There's a long section in the paper that talks about modernity. My position on modernity is actually quite simple. I'm going to assume that Africa has always lived in the modern world. And when we talk of modernity, I actually just assume the ideas, the thoughts, the theories, the technological, the mechanical devices, and all of the institutions that help us organize the living space which we occupy here on Earth. And sometimes those ideas, where they have been carried further, it leads to more advanced technological developments. But in terms of time and periodization, all of us share modernity together. The others may be far advanced, and so the whole notion that Africa is primitive because it lacks the same kind of technology that the rest of the world has, it's not something that I am considering here or willing to debate. However, I think the caution here is that one cannot ignore the fact that even though one makes this claim about modernity in the African context, that to a large extent Europe is responsible for the way modernity has been experienced in Africa, and for that reason created some of the issues that are being contested today, especially in the case of land. I think this has been studied widely. I remember many years the Latin American theologian Enrique Dussel wrote about the experiences of those whom he called on the underside of modernity, something that many others have written about. So that is clear, and I am not going to adjudicate that here, but I just want to point out that from my perspective, Africa has always lived in the modern times, and times, I think, is the operating word here. The second broad remark that I want to make based on that project and without reading the paper is the fact that land and boundary crisis in Cameroon reflects what is going on throughout the continent. Several years ago, many historians and political scientists began writing about land and land boundaries, not only because they had stumbled into a new idea, but because the reality was there. There were farmer-grazier problems all over Africa. In addition to the farmer-grazier problems, there was a new, I think for lack of a better expression, growing of latifundia, in which big agro-industrial companies were moving into Africa, so much so that most people who studied it argued that Africa's land is up for grabs again, and that's the reality. There are very few countries that you can go to where there are no tensions related to land. In Cameroon itself, there have been so many tensions reported, so much so that in the last few years, in one small district in Cameroon, in Womb, almost 2,000 land cases were brought before the courts to be adjudicated, if not by the courts, but by the civil administration. And in most of those cases, the civil authorities were not really very proactive in solving these things because they benefited from all of this. And so Catherine Boone several years ago argued that one will not understand Africa well, or the economies of Africa, if one failed to take into consideration land ownership, in the part of Cameroon that I come from, almost every division there has been a land dispute. Some of them have been bloody, some of them have ended up in court, Most of them are unresolved. And today, what I talk about comes from actually my village and our sister village, which has gone on since 1975. If I don't articulate anything clearly, because I have a long presentation and I'm not going to read it, I think what remains central is the fact that land tenure is not only a contestation of modernity, as I argue, but it is a very live issue that must be addressed if most countries in Africa, most countries in the post-colonial world are going to be able to make progress, either agriculturally or politically, economically. Land holds a very important space. Secondly, that is the case because land in Africa also has far more symbolic value. There are a lot of religious beliefs and attitudes associated with land, and one cannot minimize. And then the third aspect of that, which harks back to the position of the authority, is the fact that both the colonial and post-colonial administrations came up with ideas of dealing with these things, which bipolarize their approaches to land. On the one hand, they talked frequently about ancestral land. They recognized that the chiefs were vested with authority to govern and manage ancestral land, yet all of the legal texts that begin with colonial times actually make the state the owner of most land. I mean, granted, it started with colonial practices which, in the case of the French, the argument was that any land that was vacant was automatically that of the state. And they carried that. Germans the same. In German, it was the Grundbuch. If you didn't have a land certificate, a land title, that land was given over generally to European companies. And a specific case in Cameroon is the Bakwere lands, which the government expropriated hundreds of thousands of acres. And it would be used to build what in Cameroon is one of the largest agro-industrial projects, the Cameroon Development Corporation. Now, the Cameroon Development Corporation was established on Bakwere land. The people had no choice. The CDC has since changed hands from the Germans to the British, to the Cameroon, and more recently to the Cameroon government. More recently, even that area where CDC headquarters was located in Bota, in the English-speaking part of the world, because it has remained the only viable agro-industrial plant and project in Cameroon, the Cameroon government has moved the headquarters away from Bota in the southwest region of Cameroon to Yaoundé. Now, most people you talk to joke about it, say, look, that brings the money closer so that they can spend all the money. So surprise, surprise, no surprise there. But the point here is that based on those legal structures which were established by colonial regimes, land which therefore belonged to people who owned the land given to them by their ancestors, if anything was vacant, the colonial government took it. The government of Cameroon also took it. We'll say a little bit more about that. So there is a kind of continuity, maybe not in the same way Mahmoud Mamdani talks about in Citizen and Subject, but the kind of practices which were established during colonial times that would spill over into the post-colonial state, and the post-colonial state has been either unwilling or unable to enact a very different kind of legislation. And we'll talk a little bit about the land law of 1975 in Cameroon to illustrate that. So let's go back then, and let me just tell you a story. In 1975, the people of Njirong, they're just across the stream. Both villages have lived like brothers for years. I invited the people of Ntumbo, my village, to come and join them at the plains, because when you arrive, if you come from the southwest, you get to Bamenda Highlands. We had pictures to show you, but we can't show you. Then you get to my village. My village is an escarpment, and from that escarpment you go down very sharply about a mile or two. And when you go down that fast, you go to the plains, and the temperature there is different. It's warm, it's humid. Of course, there are mosquitoes, but you can grow almost anything. It's wonderful farmland. So the chief of Njirong invites the chief of my village, say, look, one of my sons has learned how to cultivate rice. We are doing it successfully. Come join us at Mborong, and I will give you land and your people will cultivate rice. At first, our chief sort of joked about it. Said, I hear your wives have been working on those rice farms and they are so tiny, they are small as mosquitoes. Of course, the chief of Njirong's response was, look, when they harvest the rice and eat, they will be good looking and fresh as they were in the past. Eventually, this happens in 1974. So our village goes down to Mborong, and the chief of Njirong gives them land next to a river that forms the boundary down there in Mbok Plain between Tumbok village, which is the larger village, probably 10 or 15 times larger than Njirong. And by 1975, early in 1975, or sometimes thereof, like the lawyers usually say, to keep a broad perspective on when an event took place, my village decided that they would annex that land. So they annexed it, called it Mbok Mfi. The land was previously called Mbok Rong, so they called it Mbok Mfi. Mfi at that time is the river that separates the two. So the claim was that Mbok Mfi, there was a Mbok Mfi, and it had always been. And then people raised the question, no, we know of Mbok Sop, we know of Mbok Nsop, we've never heard of Mbok Mfi. But that was the story. So tensions began. At some point, they met with the divisional administration and suggested that in the past, land tensions were resolved when both chiefs who claim to be landlords will go and pour a libation. So a big libation event was organized at Mborong. I mean, I recently talked to a divisional administrator who just laughed that off. He said, you know, I don't believe in those things. They can do whatever they do. I don't believe in those things. But it was done. And both chiefs in royal regalia and their nobles gathered, and then each person called the name of their ancestors. If this land is the land you gave me, may you indicate. Libations were poured. After that, there were counterclaims. Somebody died and Njirong Tumbo said, oh, there you go, we told you. Then several other people died and Tumbo, the Njirong people said, that's it, we told you. But notice as we go along before we summarize, here is the first contestation of authority. It is no longer the boundary set by the government. They are calling on a higher authority, the ancestors, to determine. So a second level of authority has come in. The third level of authority that is already operating at this point is the divisional administration that is bringing these people together to arbitrate. That didn't happen. It went on, there would be skirmishes. The people started hating each other. People who previously worshipped in one Baptist church, one mosque, one Catholic church for both villages, started hating each other. At some point, the people of Mtumbo village began to establish an embargo against the people of Njirong. For instance, even a small thing like taking your corn to grind at the grinding mill and make corn flour, they started blocking the women from Njirong from coming over to Mtumbo to do that. At some point, there were skirmishes, but it didn't go very far. Then the blockades continued on. And what changed the dynamics to the most vicious was the fact that the chief of Njirong in the late 80s began to negotiate with CDC, the Cameroon Development Corporation, to establish farms at Mborong. But the way he set it up was that the CDC will come and create a nursery. Each individual farmer will plant palm trees. And for those of you who do not know, palm trees mean everything in Africa. These palms will grow. They will harvest the palms. From those palms, they will produce palm oil, which is needed. In most part of Africa, Nigeria, Cameroon, the worst indication of poverty is that you are eating your soup without palm oil. Palm oil is very important, and it's gotten from these palm trees. But it also has other products. The nuts that come from it, you can do several things with it. In addition to that, for those of you who like palm wine, you get in the morning your palm wine from the palm tree. It's always something good. It's nice. You can have it. But you can use the leaves and the branches for wood, all kinds of things. So when the CDC arrived in the region, the Ntumbo people accused the Njirong people who own Borong of selling the land to the CDC. Therefore, raising the stake of the debate by arguing that they had betrayed the ancestors. If they really owned the land, why would they do that? So we asked the chief of Njirong, as late as 4 years ago, I asked him at a convention in Boston, I said, look, I hear, Your Majesty, I hear you have sold the land. And he laughed, he said, no, in Cameroon, if you have a PhD, they always call you doctor. So he looked at me and laughed, he said, doctor, I haven't sold the land, it's you people who are selling the land in Borong. I said, no, tell me more. Then he told me a story of somebody from another village who had gone to the Ntumbo people, bought land. When he took bulldozers there to plow and, just plant the hell out of the place with everything he had, the sons of Njirong appeared with the decision of the land commission and told him, no, this is our land. The guy understood the law, packed everything and went away. Now, what changed after that? In the paper, I talk about a number of things that changed, but I think the most significant development is that, and here is again a word that is used in Africa throughout, the elites of my village, that is, most people who either have a gainful job, who completed at least and have at least a high school diploma. They keep raising the bar now. It's somebody with a university degree. Beyond that, a doctor, that's a physician, PhDs, government officials, those are the elites. The elites of my village who were never really interested in the case jumped in on the side of the Ntumbo village. And it is at that time that they began to dig into government archives to make the case that Borong was their land. How did the argument go? First, they argued that the chief of Ntumbo arrived that escarpment first, and so he owned all of the land. They argued, secondly, that for a long time there was no chief in Njirong, and the chief of Njirong was only gazetted, that is recognized as a chief by the government of West Cameroon in 1965. So therefore, he did not own land. And then they also presented actually archival materials from Mr. Carpenter, who was the assistant colonial district officer in my area at that time. He had gone to Ntumbo village taking a census. So when he went to Ntumbo Palace, they listed all the quarters, the areas, the little quarters of the village, and then they included the other village in Njirong. But in the column, it's very well tabulated. When they asked who are the quarter heads, all of the other quarter heads were listed Phi. Phi is the Wimbum title for sub-chief. But when it got to Njirong, the title they used was Nkwi Rong. In Limbum, Nkwi is a chief. So, which raises a question about archival, about research, even during colonial times. If Mr. Carpenter understood the Wimbum language at the time, he would have asked him, wait a minute. All of your quarter heads are 5, 5, 5, 5. Why is it the case that this other person is Nkwirong? And then he would have realized that there's a contestation of power going on there, that the one village doesn't want to recognize the other village. But I think there's more to that. And I have argued this elsewhere in a private dialogue with the elites of my village. Let's assume the argument that it is true that they arrived at the escarpment first. But the question would be, just because you arrive at an escarpment and they are neighboring villages, does that make you the owner of all of that land? If you contested the chieftaincy of the other village, at the time that that chieftaincy dispute was resolved, in the Wimbum tradition, a chief is recognized by several things. One, territory. Number two, the crown. Number three, the cup that that chief would pour libation. Number four, the throne. There are closed societies that the villages of the northwest region of Cameroon have, which is called Ngwarong, and so on and so forth. A chief must not have those closed societies in order to be a chief. But these elements that I have mentioned. So I said, okay, let's take for granted that that was the case. At the time the other chief was recognized by the government, these things should have been put into arbitration, especially land. But because he settled where he settled, and his village was not very much land. From his village where his palace is, you just went down the escarpment into the plains. And because at the time, nobody assumed that that would ever be any useful thing, and so he claimed it. So the administration has looked at it the same way and argued, no, you cannot make this case, even at a certain point. At one point, the Njirong people actually supported the Ntumbo people during a very important chieftaincy dispute. And at the time, the chief of Njirong submitted those documents indicating that he had been chief. He was installed in 1933. The Ntumbo people had no question about it. But the Carpenter document, which I indicated, was actually, the information was collected in 37 and published in 38. And then there's a later 1949 document from M.W. Jeffries, who was colonial district officer in the region, actually worked in eastern Nigeria for a while as colonial district officer. When he left government, he joined the faculty of Wits Witwatersrand University in Johannesburg. So this research at some point is going to take us to Wits Witwatersrand to see what he has. In which case, he makes a claim that the chief of another village quarreled with his senior chief, left that village and came to Njirong and stayed there. And then in that document, the phrase that follows is Ntumbo land. Now, the question or the way most people would look at it is, was that Jeffrey's reading of the 1938 document which made him assume that that was Ntumbo land? The only way we can know what he was thinking, if that was an interpretive statement or if that is what was told him on research in the field, is if we find his field notes. But even if we find his field notes, here is what the administration decided to do. From 1975, it took the administration many years. Finally, in 2004, in accordance with the land law of 1975, the senior divisional officer of Donga Mantung, the big district where these two villages belong, appointed a land consultative committee. That's what they are called, but also called land commission. The land consultative committee is made up of the chief of both villages, two of their nobles, then neighboring chiefs from the three villages that share boundaries with them. And then the ex-officio members of those committees are the divisional delegate for agriculture, the divisional delegate for land planning, the divisional delegate for forestry or animal husbandry, as the case may be. The senior divisional officer can chair that committee, or he can appoint somebody to chair that committee. And they met at Morong in June of 2004, heard submissions from both villages, interviewed the chiefs of the neighboring villages, and looked at whatever submissions all belongs to Jerome, not to Mbo village. But in a very unusual move, that commission also gave the bigger village, my village, Tumbo village, the right of use on condition that they would respect, the term in Cameroon is the native Sunday. That is the sacred day of the Njirong village. These sacred days in Cameroon are generally determined by the day when the previous chief dies. When a chief dies, it is a cosmic event. So that day that he died, or in some villages is the day that he is buried, or the day that the death celebration is announced and the celebrations begin, that day becomes a sacred day. You don't go to farms, you don't do anything, you probably are not even allowed to harvest vegetables. You don't touch anything green, because if you use the language they use, that will spoil the land. So, Tumbo village is given the right of use in recognition that the land belongs to Njirong. The only requirement in 2004 was that they should respect the native Sunday, the sacred day of the other village. No, Tumbo village didn't like that decision, and so they have continued to contest it. And when the big agro complex CDC came down to Mbo, that's when the elites of Tumbo then joined the fight and came up with all of these documents. In 2013, actually before that, 2012, there were reports that Tumbo village wanted to sell a section of the land again. Then the chief of Njirong, who actually lives in Washington, D.C., happened to be in Cameroon. He heard the story, so he went to the courts to seek a court order that they should not sell that piece of property. Then the magistrate said he was going to go and inspect the territory. I mean, by law, they're supposed to do that before he hears submissions in court and takes testimony and rules. Then it is alleged that, and I say that this is an allegation because this is something we are still looking into as part of the research, that people from Tumbo then vowed that if the magistrate, that is the judge, stepped down there would be blood. So the chief of Njirong called the judge and said, don't come. If you come, there will be bloodshed. The judge then ordered both parties to show up at the court in Kambe. But before he got there, the politics of Cameroon works in a very different way. Even though there are separation of powers, you have the judiciary, you have the legislative, the administrative. The administrative part of government in Cameroon is powerful. You know, I mean, sometimes, I don't know if that's a good thing. A judge in Texas can call President Obama's executive order unconstitutional, and that doesn't take place. No, in Cameroon, from colonial times, a district officer's decision, it is clearly stated, shall be treated as the force of law. So the administrative side just simply informed the magistrate, look, you are interfering in something that you have no business in. And then gave the magistrate all the information they had at their disposal. So when the two parties showed up in court, the magistrate ruled that this case had already been decided, but if there are further questions, he is sending them back to the Land Consultative Committee. So he dismissed the case, dismissed all charges that were brought against the people of Tumbo. Now, when the people of Tumbo left court that day, they were jubilating, they were celebrating, they treated that as they had won the case, the land is now theirs, and so on and so forth. Even among those of us from Tumbo, an open cyber argument opened up. And many of us tried to calm the detention and said, no, we haven't won a case. This goes back to the Land Consultative Commission, and that means that the 2004 decision is still the force of law. So if we want to appeal this, at that point we said, look, let's get an attorney who can litigate this rather than waste time and continue all of this hatred. Nobody listened to that. So 1 year later, a fight broke up at Mborong. One person from Jerome was severely wounded. The Baptist pastors arrived on the scene. They were able to stop the fight. They transported that prince from Jerome, who was very badly wounded by some people from Tumbo. The Jerome people took some people from Tumbo hostages, vowing that if he died, they would kill those people. The Baptist pastors were able to defuse the situation, and yes, unfortunately, the gentleman died. And then there was tension. The administration, meaning the senior divisional officer, deployed forces of law and order in Cameroon. That usually means the army, the gendarmerie, and the police of different branches to go there. Of course, people were beaten. They did all they could to try to prevent order. At the end of this conflict, the administration issued another order declaring at that point emphatically that the land belongs to Jerome, citing the 2004 decision, citing all of the other evidence they have received, made it very clear. And then at that point, exceeded that previous authority, required Ntumbo village to pay tribute to the chief of Jerome. Furthermore, even went further than that, that they cannot carry out their ethnic celebrations on the land of Jerome. If they wanted to celebrate any traditional things, they should go to their own village and do those celebrations, and that they considered that the end of the case. I don't need to tell you that there's a lot of pain and suffering in both villages. Many people who used to work at Mborong are suffering. They cannot afford money for food. They cannot afford money for school fees. The hatred between the two villages, I mean, I have never seen anything like this. Even within the royal families, the intermarriage between both royal families, you're counting several men who have married from the other village or several women who have married into the other family. My own sub-family, I can easily count more than 12 intermarriage between the two villages. My own mother comes from Jerome village, was a princess in Jerome village. And so it is a very tense situation. And so let's briefly now, I think you have gotten the gist. Let me then just highlight what I see as the complexities. Let's begin with authority. The state of Cameroon has been taxed to the maximum based on this case. It has gone on from since 1975. And throughout, the state has taken a position that supports Jerome based on what they claim are the historical records and based on just the reality. That piece of land has been called Mborong for a very, very, very long time. Tumbo has never contested it, and the neighboring chiefs have said that Tumbo never owned any land at Mborong. It was always Mborong. And by the way, the administration has argued they call it Mborong. Mborong means the plain of Rong. Rong is Jerome village. So that's the position they have taken. But I think in order to see the complexity or what is being challenged here or what is the unspoken problem here is what has the state done? What can the state do? Regardless of whether somebody supports Jerome or supports Ntumbo, I think at the heart of the decision is the land law of 1975, the legal instruments that are used. If you go by the legal instruments, the state is correct, the administration is right. There's nothing they can do. This is a very just solution. But the question is there a middle ground? Is there a middle ground? What else can be done other than sheer use of force to bring these two villages together? Over the course of almost 50 years, there have been charges and counter-charges of bribery and corruption and so on and so forth, to a point where at some point the senior divisional officer for Donga Mantung Division, the chief administrative officer, ordered several people from Tumbo locked up. And he asked them, you need to demonstrate how much money you gave to me, whom you sent to give me the money, when that money was given, otherwise I'm suing you for libel. The reason I say this is because the land law doesn't really cut it. The land law recognizes ancestral lands. Yet at the same time, the land law also claims that all land in Cameroon is government land. So it's a bipolar position, which to what people can say, in principle, if all land is government land, don't we have a right to be able to farm? And it's a very human dimension here. We need to feed our children. We need to make money. We need to do. So there's something about the land law which is a carryover from the colonial administration, which is not working. It is not working. For the people of Jerome, yeah, I think it's working great, because they're a much more smaller village. The larger village, which just really taken over everything. At the level of the village, the local authority has been challenged and called into question. What do you do if before 2004 both chiefs go and pour libation and nothing happens? Do you really believe in the ancestors at that point? Are the gods of the village still working? Or should we junk all of that and adopt a secular model which adjudicates everything through the law, which both villages have actually been trying to do? That's a question and tension that remains unresolved. But related to traditional authority, for a very long time, both villages have had a closed society called Nsingong. Nsingong was a closed society that had the powers to protect the villages from any kind of ravages. So at a certain time, especially during the planting and harvesting season, Nsingong will come out at night. Both villages would be under lockdown. I don't want to make a joke, but sometimes when I hear about lockdown in Houston, I just laugh, because it's nothing as frightening as being under a lockdown in Cameroon when a closed society is coming out at night. It's a lockdown because they believe it is life and death. So Nsingong will come out, go walk through the boundaries of both villages and protect both villages. Now here, for almost 40 years, both villages, host boundaries were protected by a closed institution from the other village and are being contested. Where is the Nsingong power? Instead, what has come up is accusations of witchcraft, that people, witches from both Njirong and Tumbo, have connived, meet in witch houses, and are doing everything to prolong this battle as long as it can take. So there's that contestation of traditional power there. I think the last thing that I should mention very briefly, and then make couple of remarks, deals with religious authority. The Contending Modernity project at Notre Dame was focused largely on Muslims and Catholics. And it makes sense. Notre Dame is a Catholic university, but they also wanted diversity, and Muslims probably presented the most diversity in that kind of an inquiry. But in this case, the people in Tumbo that we have talked to are mostly people from Tumbo. Muslims are mostly in Tumbo. The largest religious group in the area is the Baptist Church. So technically, they are not part of the project, but they have become part of the project for a number of reasons. Part of the reason is just that, one, most people in Tumbo and Jirong are Baptists. The Baptist Christians in Tumbo are so adamant, so involved in this land dispute. In fact, some of them have come up with what I consider the most vitriolic language about this whole thing. In fact, it got to a point where at the larger Baptist association, Baptists from Tumbo Church would be stepping aside and say they cannot sit in the same room with Baptists from Jirong. They could not be served food at the same place. And the Baptist pastors looked at it and said, this is ridiculous. You don't bring this to the church. We can't tolerate that. If you have anything to work out, you better work that out as Christians rather than do this. And secondly, the Baptists, I think, have become part of the conversation, at least for us as researchers, because when that fighting broke out in which Evaristos Shea, that's the prince from Jerome, would be killed, it was Baptist pastors who heard the struggle, showed up on the spot first, then calmed down, carried out peace, talked, persuaded the people not to carry out much violence. I think there's still a lot that we need to learn from those pastors, what actually happened. But if you go back to the Contending Modernity project, the Muslims, a large majority of them all support Ntumbo. In fact, there are even accusations that certain Malams in Ntumbo used to cook medicine to make sure that the Ntumbo side will win. And certain Alajis, everybody believes in Africa that if you have become an Alaji, you're a very rich man. And that certain Alajis, that's those who had gone on pilgrimage to Hajj, are financing the Ntumbo cause. And, but there was a very important moment in which one of the Muslims actually intervened in a very, I think, positive manner. There was a debate between the soldiers and the police. The soldiers were allegedly roughing up people, they were even accused of abusing women. And when the inspector of police who was there on the team complained, the soldiers had him beaten. And then one Muslim leader in the village who had the district officer's phone number called him. And he came immediately. And then even when he got there, this is what the district officer told him. The soldiers were there beating up this police officer. They would have killed him if they didn't break up the fight. And so there are people within the Islamic community who are trying to stop down the escalation and brutality from the people who have been asked to enforce the law. The Catholic Church has spent some time trying to do peace and reconciliation, working on justice, trying to move forward. But the last report from Sister O'Shea, from our conversations with her, she says that she thinks that Ntumbo village is such a large village, like I said, 10 or 15 times larger than Jerome, that they feel that they cannot go and sit down and negotiate with them. And so you have these contestation that involves all of these areas. What are the way forward? Very quickly, when we asked the president of the development committee of Ntumbo, he said a lot of things, but let me just bring to your attention, and I do this in the interest of full disclosure. He argued that he thought the best thing that could happen to the village is that the Fon of Njirong, the chief of the other village, then Dr. Philemon Fo, and then a certain Dr. Elias Bongmba, that what these three people say, the village will listen to. Well, I mean, you know, the last one is yours truly. You know, my point is, yes, that's my village. I want both villages to work at Mborong. I want both to come to a place where both villages will work. I thought the 2004 decision was actually really remarkable. In fact, like I told elites from my village, if the divisional officer that issued that order was a white man, we would have called that decision a Solomonic decision. Say, oh, the land belongs to so-and-so, but you have the right of use. Only respect the sacred day of those. We would have been dancing in the street and calling that a Solomonic decision. And that tells you actually sometimes the tragedy of the post-colonial state. That in as much as we lament colonialism, sometimes we still are not able to see wise decisions and judgments that come from our own political leaders. But let me go back. 1975, we had the first development committee meeting. At that time, I was a rookie Baptist preacher in my village. I had been working on the land, the chieftaincy dispute, so I read a lot of documents. So I told my village, I said, look, based on what I have seen, I don't think we have a case here. I don't think we can ever make the case. I really don't think so. And then I shut my mouth. Both villages had one church, I was the pastor. probably easily 1,500 people Sunday morning sitting. The chief of the other village was there. The queen mother of the other village was there. I mean, I could have messed up the village, but I never brought it up. I never talked about it. And I said, well, if you want to litigate this, go ahead and do it. So it just struck me as really not comical, but actually quite sad that someone would think that the key to the solution lies with me. And I have not been in touch with any political administration in Cameroon since 1975, when my task with the chieftaincy dispute was done. Philemon IV, they blame him because he was lastly pastor of the Etukebe Baptist Church in Yaoundé, ironically a church where I was the founding pastor. And a member of that church is the Prime Minister of Cameroon, so they think Philemon IV has been influencing the Prime Minister of Cameroon to make the government rule against them. No, that is not the case. That is not the case. So this is where we are. I think I conclude the paper by drawing from the work of Bourdieu in terms of the nature of the idea of habitus. And I said, if we just change that notion of habitus and just look at practices, because really that's what it's talking about, and look at that social network, not only as a way of talking about social relations, but the very grounds and basis of livelihood, then the question then becomes, how can land tenure, land boundary disputes be adjudicated in such a way that the best practices are brought to the table in order to make the land available to everybody. This is a work in progress, but I think all I have done this afternoon is tell you a story, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Don't go too far.
Yeah.
Because you'll want to respond.
Come back. Okay, yeah. Thank you. I'll just sit here.
Good afternoon. Most part of the day, I'm Gregory Milker Bars from the Blair School of Music, but right now, I am Peter Sirkin from the Law School, our colleague. Thank you very much for inviting me, Peter, to comment. I'm sorry not to be with you in person, although I am here, but find myself unexpectedly laid up with a broken ankle. Poor Peter. I'm sorry, Chris. I teach property, land use, and local government law in the law school. And while I approach this topic from an entirely domestic U.S. perspective, I find a lot that is both familiar and interesting in this example from Cameroon. And regardless, I very much appreciate seeing such a granular account of this kind of land and boundary dispute. The thesis of the paper, Doctor's paper, Elias's paper, as I read it, is that this land dispute reflects current tensions over modernity, and specifically the tension between law on the one hand and tradition and religion on the other. But I want to suggest a different way of framing this dispute as really being about the intersection of public power and private rights. Here, however, the notion of public power seems opaque to me, and it may be that the real struggle with modernity in this case is a struggle with conceptions of public power. In the United States, when a local government seeks to expand its boundaries, it can try to annex unincorporated adjacent land, or residents and owners can seek to incorporate the land themselves to become their own local government and prevent annexation from a neighboring town. In Nashville, for example, the areas outside of the city itself were in effect annexed to the city in the 1960s when Nashville merged with its county, thereby extending its control over what had been separate nearby suburbs. When there is conflict around annexation and incorporation, and there often is, complex voting rules are used to generate outcomes. In some states, owners of the land to be annexed have an effective veto power over the annexation. In others, all that is required is a majority vote of the annexing municipality. Procedures are contested and sometimes challenged in court, and there will undoubtedly be winners and losers in these fights. But the stakes, at least, are quite clear, even if outcomes are often uncertain. Is the contested land subject to the taxing and land use authority of the annexing municipality? In other words, the fight is over the power to levy property taxes, to capture some of the value from the land, and over the power to assert land use controls to manage the development patterns on the land. This brings us back to the I want to know about the real in this case, because I don't really understand what the fight is actually about. It does not seem as though the fight between the Zumba and Jerome villages is about individual ownership. That is, I inferred from the paper that that which individuals end up using the land does not depend on which village controls it. In law, we tend to view political disputes like this through the lens of public choice theory, which describes the actions of governments or villages by the political stakes for individual state actors. So I also wanted to know in this dispute, what are the interests of the village elders? Why do they individually care about the outcome? Would it affect their status in the village? Would it affect their personal wealth? What precisely were the stakes from their perspective? Stepping back, one way of framing the question is whether this dispute is really about the individual's access and use of the land fought through the villages, or whether this is the villages contesting control over the land on their own behalf. Ultimately, these reflect two very different interactions between the public and the private. But to understand this, I would need to know more about the nature of villages in Cameroon. Are villages more like sovereigns with sovereignty over their own land that is exercised on behalf of individual property owners? Or are the villages themselves more like private owners? If the villages are more like local governments in the US, if in other words they are more like mini sovereigns, then the relationship between Cameroon and the villages would implicate local government law. Maybe there are sovereigns between them, like the War people, which resemble states, in which case the villages are like local governments. Maybe the domestic US system does not translate well at all. But if we conceive of the villages as sovereigns seeking to exercise sovereign control over the contested land, then this is the kind of fight normally resolved through the democratic process. It is also a difficult question from who owns the land in the sense of a private owner. Sovereign authority over land is different from individual private ownership. But maybe the villages are not like sovereigns and are more like private owners in Cameroon. If so, then this dispute and these kinds of disputes would not typically be resolved through the democratic or political process, but instead as a matter of property law. The question and the allocation of the resource would depend on things like community expectations, reliance, norms, and traditions. But this is the nature of the dispute. It does not tell us much about modernity in Cameroon. It is just a contested property claim, and we would often look to traditions, including religion, to decide who wins. What happens in the US, that happens in the US as well. So ultimately, I want to know more about what villages are in Cameroon, whose interests are really being contested here, and what the real stakes are for the various parties. Thank you very much. I am Christopher Assert. They applaud me now. That's Christopher Assert. Sir, do you have any responses?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then perhaps we'll have time for one or two questions afterwards.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor.
Yes. These are very, very good questions. I am really very delighted that he took time to read the paper. I think up front, some of the things that he raises about the nature of the village, especially that section where he talks about sovereignty and private ownership, I think is at the crux of this case. In framing, as I said earlier, in framing this discussion this afternoon, I did not go into those details. And what is missing is the history of the Wimbum people. There's a little section in the paper about chieftaincy among the Wimbum. And the Wimbum people happen to be very different from their neighbors in that those chiefs govern as sovereign leaders of their own villages. In other words, you can imagine the chief as a small president of that community. And as he rightly says, towards the latter part of the response, in that case, it is the traditions, the values, the symbolic beliefs that have been held over time, which can be used to adjudicate something like this if you look at that. But it is not, those are sovereign villages. And whatever is considered private property rights are assigned within the villages to the sub-chiefs, who then assign those properties to individual members. As you know, I always like that expression, as we speak in my own household, in my own quarter, the sub-chief is quarreling with another member of the quarter for a piece of land. And so we may be dealing with a mixed system here, which appears like sovereign individual villages, but where also private property is guaranteed, except that all of that thing is understood as they are each holding it in trust from the ancestors. I think that's an important here. And so there may be like a local government, but no, the local government arm of it comes with the divisional administration. They are the ones who then execute state laws, property rights, land tenure, land ownership. And it's unfortunate that I couldn't go detailedly into the land law, because the land law is actually quite detailed. If you need a piece of land, you have to go acquire it the way you go acquire it. If I have a large plot of land, you can come to me. It has already been given to me by my sub-chief, who has gotten it from the chief of the village. Then I can sell it to you. In the past, you didn't do that. But today, land has been commoditized. And so the aspects of modernity that he rightly says I am not spelling very clearly, it involves all of those transactions. The fact now that one can commoditize land. But you come to me, I sell you land. By Cameroon government law, if I can issue a receipt, and then the person then begins a very long process of acquiring a land certificate in order to hold land tenure. And that is the most corrupt thing. Because in Cameroon, only very wealthy individuals can actually acquire a land title. You pay for the fuel, you provide food, you provide transportation, they charge you extra this and this. In addition to all the fees that you need to do it, all the members of the commission expect a certain bribe. So sometimes it takes, so you have those two. The democratic process will not really work because the administrators have corrupted the whole system. So here, it is a mixed bag, but his questions actually helped me to think clearly about this notion of sovereignty. And all of the others, I think the distinction between public power and private rights is one that is very well noted. I think both are at play here. In terms of public power, the chiefs of both villages see themselves as protecting what belongs to the entire village. Of course, in the end, they get a certain prestige, they are respected, they get tribute from those who work there. But the issue for them is the symbolic attitude towards land that they believe was owned by their instructor. And at a certain point, as we go on this, I think the task for us will be to critically examine land law in Cameroon and raise the question, is it possible in a context where communal land is the norm for people to actually be able to think of property rights, even if they can learn something from the United States or other Western countries? Can we get to that point where it is possible to define property rights and come up with the kind of legislation that allocates that. And if we get to that point, will African villages have to give up ancestral sovereignty? Maybe that may be the case. Nobody knows. I think we are dealing with uncharted territory here. Yeah, thank you.
As Christopher Sir, can I accept your remarks? This is a wonderful way of opening up our series on Africa at a Crossroads. I can't think of a more perfect opening lecture, so thank you very much. But we have time for,
Thank you.
Would you take one or two questions?
Yes, please, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So thank you for honoring us with your access to your visit and for accepting our convocation. So I work in global health and I'm from Nigeria.
Right.
And what I'm thinking is, do you think things would have been different if Cameroon had a similar setup to Nigeria, where in 1978 the land tenure system was completely changed and the traditional rulers had no role in allocating land. Pretty much the state took over the responsibility. And even though there is corruption, but at least the process has some resemblance of transparency, instead of having an inherited system whereby someone just assumes that power because that person has some link to the traditional authority. In this case, it's an elected individual who would have decision making in terms of whether the application for land is not accepted. Do you think that kind of system would have made a difference in this case, or do you
I'm inclined to think so. And let me tell you why. I think in my village now there is so much pride, because even the Wimbum Cultural and Development Association, the national umbrella organization in Cameroon that is sponsors development in our villages, went to talk to Ntumbo village, asking them to meet with the other village and try to work this out. My village told that committee that if there are going to be any talks, they want to come to the table as the elder brother. And in Africa, you know what an elder brother means. An elder brother means an elder brother can shut up you, say, look, shut up, sit down. Or you must do what I tell you. And so if the land law of 1975 were written the way the Nigerian land law of 78 was written, I think it would be a much better thing. What do the Cameroon villages do? They give up ancestral sovereignty. And is that a bad thing to give up ancestral sovereignty? No. When you give up that kind of sovereignty over a commodity like land, which we must reinterpret in a new generation, especially at a time when providing food for the citizens of the country is so important. I think a system that would manage it judiciously is more preferable than hanging on to ancestral requirements. I've talked to the chief of Jerome over and over about this, and his response is, if that's the law of the land, we will obey the law of the land. But as long as the law of the land recognizes us as the manager of our ancestral lands, we are not asking very much. We are asking them to come and walk and respect our regulations. We don't even want to take any tribute from them. So in short, I mean, I would consider that very seriously.
So my student Joey and I were doing an independent study on religion and human rights. And as part of the study, we read all of the various declarations of human rights and large long and history of human rights. And I've been really surprised the way that land ownership, the right to land ownership, is included in these declarations as a human right, where I
That's a very good question, and part of the literature of, this would take us to will go to the human rights literature, the human rights structure in Africa, which is very, very elaborate, actually beautiful on paper, but sometimes not respected. If I go by the first question, I would say, no, it shouldn't be, because that is something that a village can no longer say this is our right. If we craft legislation that leads us to that point, and the last part I actually added some things to here about how that kind of legislation, an outline about what we think it can go. So yes, I would say no, it shouldn't be treated that way. The problem with the language about the African Charter and people's rights, when they say that it is then linked to the rights of indigenous people. If it is linked and part of the discourse on indigenous people, then they have their rights. The question then becomes, what happens when you think of what is happening in North Dakota now? The case in North Dakota in terms of property rights and the legal laws of this country, I think probably can be resolved, because the native peoples are themselves saying, we just don't want this to pass near our water, drinking water. So that's easily negotiated and resolved. But when you have rights assigned to land in that way, my ancestors own this, we own this, and so on and so forth, there's a certain point at which it begins to hinder development. Like I tell the chief of Jerome, who technically would be my uncle, no, at a certain point, the majority of people in Tumbo have to come to you and you have to give them land to work. And he says, yes, I want to do that. But it's that they are coming as a group and claiming part of my land as their land, and he says that that's the problem. So if it gets to that kind of a point, then land should not really be treated as a human right, because it is regulated by law. The law determines what the rights of people are. Then that right at that point will be determined by private property or private laws or laws that govern the individual's rights to exist and operate. And I think the only thing that one could say about land claims in places like Africa and in Cameroon and other places in Africa is that when they make such claims, they also devote time to develop. The stand they take also makes it difficult for large agro-industrial companies that will not care about the area from encroaching into the land and replacing food crops with cash cropping. It's a very difficult thing, but I think it can be negotiated. The more we can go towards the state having clearly laid out legislation which governs the execution of land and makes land tenure something that everybody has access to, I am all for it.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Mr. Bongmba.
Thank you.